Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today I wanted to make a video speaking all about books that I think you'll like if you like fairy tales. I really love fairy tales. This has been an area that I've been interested in for a very long time. Some of you may know because I've mentioned it a few times on this channel that when I was doing my undergrad and also when I was doing my postgrad, I took classes specifically on fairy tales, and I really loved learning about their history, about the meaning behind them, where they came from, how they've changed. All of this kind of stuff I find incredibly fascinating, and I just, in general, love fairy tales. We have this really cool and interesting tradition of fairy stories. So yeah, that's what today's video is going to be about. I'm going to be sharing books that I think you guys will like if you're also interested in fairy tales. There are a few different books on this list, so let's jump into it, and without further ado, here are some books that you would like if you like fairy tales. Book number one will come as no surprise to many of you because I have spoken about it so many times on this channel. I kind of have this like weird little quandary when I make these videos of like recommendation videos because I worry that I'm repeating myself way too much. But there are some books that just can be recommended so many times. And in this context, this is The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. This novel was published in 1974, and it is sort of the book that Angela Carter is really well known for. This is effectively a compilation of short stories, and often it gets called a retelling or a modernization of older fairy stories. Angela Carter didn't really look at it that way. These aren't like, you know, the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales retold. They're completely new stories, but they're grounded in these fairy tale archetypes. And Angela Carter is so strong in terms of like short stories. She's amazing at like just painting a really small picture and like getting all that imagery in and like not pulling her punches. I just love her short fiction so much, and like all of her fiction because she's amazing. So yeah, the fairy stories in this one, the titular story, The Bloody Chamber, is a retelling of Bluebeard. It's quite large compared to this book. I think it's around a third of it. It's like pretty long. Well, pretty long in the context of the size of this book. And then there's a couple of retellings of Red Riding Hood, Beauty and the Beast. There's a kind of funny one about Puss in Boots, and then my favorite one is The Earl King. If you're into fairy tales and you like gothic fairy tales or things that are a bit darker and more scary, The Bloody Chamber is really brilliant. Angela Carter is so iconic, especially in this realm. I cannot recommend The Bloody Chamber enough. You guys will hear me speak about Angela Carter until probably the end of time. Book number two is Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. This is a story set in like, it's kind of like magical Poland. It's a fairy tale world which is like really beautifully constructed, inspired by the Polish fairy tales of Naomi Novik's childhood. It's like really snowy and cold, and there's this fairy king who's actually called a Starrick, I think. I've only ever read it. I haven't heard it pronounced, so I'm assuming it's Starrick. This is how it's spelt. And it's just this beautiful fantasy story that's really quite reminiscent of fairy tales and feels very fairy tale-esque to me. It's based loosely on the tale of Rumpelstiltskin. And yeah, again, it's a fairy king. It's very snowy. It's just really good. The main character in this story is named Miriam, and she is the daughter of a very unsuccessful moneylender. There are two more major point of view characters in this as well. Wanda, who is a peasant girl who cannot read, and then there's also Irina, who is betrothed to the Tsar of this land, and he's a very dark, scary man, and there's magic in this, and it's just like overall a really good fun read. Again, you would have seen this book if you watched my Christmassy reading vlog. This is an excellent story to read at Christmas time or to read as you're going into the winter. So brilliant book, really love it, definitely recommend. Book number three is The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro. This book was published in 2015, I think it was? Yeah, 2015. That was 2 years before Kazuo Ishiguro actually won the Nobel Prize for Literature, which was 2017. Ishiguro is an amazing author, and he has written a lot of really brilliant things. I want to read more by him. But The Buried Giant is apparently the most unique thing he's written. It's his most recent novel. It took him like 10 years, and it is like a literary fantasy story. This book could probably sit in two different camps. It's very much inspired by myth and Arthurian myth. Arthurian myth, and like pre-medieval English history. And it's also like got these like really lovely little fairy tale-esque bits. So I think it could sit in like two different camps of being inspired by fairy tale and being inspired by myth. And yeah, this is a more literary story. It's a little bit more slower. It's not a fast-paced plot, but it's about these two older people named Axel and Beatrice who live in this sort of like closed-off community in Britain in pre-medieval, post-Arthurian time. That might be wrong. I don't know very much about this period of history, but I think that's the time period. It's this sort of time period where the Saxons and Britons are fighting and like all this stuff. And it's a land where there's ogres and there's a literal giant buried in the ground. There's a few more like fantasy creatures like that. And essentially they live in this situation where there's this collective forgetfulness. And Axel and Beatrice remember that at some point they had a son, and they sort of set off and go on this journey they think they're on a journey to find their son. I can't really go into too much more detail than that because Kazuo Ishiguro is amazing at these sorts of plots where you can't really say too much without giving it away. But it's this really, really beautiful and interesting book. It's probably the most unique fantasy story I've ever read. And overall, I just think it's really, really cool. Oh, and also it taught me so much about this particular part in like British history, which I didn't know anything about. And I, since reading this, still really want to read history books from this period. So I actually learned a lot from this book. I found it really, really interesting. Book number 4 is The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making, and this is by Catherine M. Valenti. This book was also in my like favorite YA/middle grade book video, so if you want to go and read that, I'll put it up in the cards. But yeah, this is, I mean, like it says fairyland, so obviously it's related to fairy tales, but this is a lovely, beautiful, absurd, whimsical, just great middle grade story. It is about a young girl named September. I believe she's 12, and essentially she's like washing dishes in her kitchen at home. Her dad is off in the war, her mother is a mechanical engineer, and she is spirited off to fairyland. September meets a wyvern whose father he thinks is a library, so he considers himself to be a wyvery. So yeah, a cross between a wyvern and a library, and his name is A through L because those are the books in the library that he represents. It's sort of like Alice in Wonderland, so that's kind of what this feels like, but it's just very, very colourful and magical, and I love this story. It's so cute, it makes me very happy, and yeah, just pretty much a really, really lovely story. Number 5 is a non-fiction one, and it is a book/essay, depending on how it's published, by J.R.R. Tolkien called On Fairy Stories. And this is essentially Tolkien diving into fairy stories as like a literary form and looking at how we use these fairy stories. He spells it inconsistently. The title is On Fairy Stories, and then he calls it fairy, F-A-E-R, as a sort of, yeah, like really, really interesting way to look at the genre. He looks at how we use fairy stories to really like hold up a mirror to society. And reading this particular essay by him is actually really enlightening for looking into Tolkien's own works, because you get to see his perspective and his politics and his opinions on fantasy in this like really literary sort of way. I really enjoyed reading this for my research. I found it really helpful to me personally. And yeah, it's a really, really interesting nonfiction read. I think this particular essay came out of like a presentation he was going to do. It was published in the late 1930s. If you're interested in Tolkien and you like nonfiction, then I definitely recommend checking this out. Yeah, really, really interesting nonfiction look at the like literary form of fairy tales. And then in terms of recommending you guys like actual proper like fairy tale books, I have the Fairy Tales from Around the World by Andrew Lang. Lang is very, very well known, as are like all the authors I'm about to show you. This is a beautiful edition which is published by Barnes & Noble. Okay, this is a beautiful edition which is hardback. The paper is very, very thin. It's like almost like Bible thin. On top of that, I also have the Grimm's Fairy Tales in this beautiful edition. Again, hardback and very beautifully coloured. I feel like they go together reasonably well because this one's also published by Barnes & Noble, so that makes sense. And then the last main fairy tale compilation I have is in this collection of Oscar Wilde stories. So this particular book was published in 1983, so it's pretty old. It's this beautiful old hardback green book, and in it it's got the Happy Prince and Other Tales, so these are Oscar Wilde's fairy tales as well. And then lastly, I just wanted to touch on 2 more books that I haven't actually read myself, but I'm really excited to read. I always struggle with making these particular kinds of videos and giving you guys like blanket recommendations in a particular area, because whenever I film one of these videos, there's also a bunch of books I'm really excited to read. So I figured I'd just slot these books in here. So keeping in mind that I don't know if I love these books yet because I haven't read them. But the first one is called The Bear and the Nightingale. And this one is by Catherine Arden. So I'll put the cover in here. I get really strong Spinning Silver vibes from this particular one. I know that it is set in like the Russian wilderness. There's a stepmother. There seems to be like dark forces at play. It looks really cool and I really want to read it. And then the other one is The Changeling by Victor Lavelle, which looks a lot darker. So this one is like also tagged as horror on Goodreads, and I don't particularly read a lot of horror, so I'm interested to like read it for that reason as well. So I'll just read the Goodreads thing to you because I thought it sounded really intriguing. And it is one man's thrilling journey through an enchanted world to find his wife, who has disappeared after seemingly committing an unforgivable act of violence. So that's sort of like the premise for this particular book. It looks really cool. I love the covers for both of these books. I am such a sucker for a really beautifully designed cover. I love book covers. Yeah, I'm really excited to read those. I'm probably going to read them really soon, so potentially in a favorites video or a vlog coming up, you'll get to hear my opinions on those. But yeah, those were all the books I wanted to speak about. I hope you guys found some good, interesting sounding books that you want to read from this list. Please comment down below any books that you like that are inspired by fairy tales or that you think have like really cool fairy tale-esque themes in them. Again, I always love adding more things to my Excel spreadsheet where I keep my list of books I need to read. Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's like a new level of being a complete nerd, is if you keep your reading like TBR list on Excel. But yeah, anyway, thank you guys so very much for watching. I hope you're all doing well at the moment. Take care, and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.